Hello and welcome to Westminster Watch with me, Nick de Bois. It was billed as one of the Tories' last chances to meaningfully move the dial before the next election. But Chancellor Jeremy Hunt's budget appears to be catching criticism from across the political spectrum. After a widely trailed 2 percentage point cut to national insurance leaked to the press earlier in the week, surprisingly, there were no more surprises. No big tax cuts and no red meat for the right wing of the Tory party. Instead, Jeremy Hunt took two of Labour's ideas, extending the windfall tax on oil and gas companies and changing the status of non-domiciled foreign workers. That will reduce the opposition's party ability to fund their own policies ahead of the election.
After looking at the issue over many months, I've concluded that we can indeed introduce a system which is both fairer and remains competitive with other countries. So the government will abolish the current tax system for non-doms, get rid of the outdated concept of domicile, I aim to please all sides of the House in all my budgets.
Britain in recession, the national credit card maxed out, and despite the measures today, the highest tax burden for 70 years. The first Parliament since records began to see living standards fall, confirmed by this budget today. That is their record. It is still their record. Give with one hand and take even more with the other, and nothing they do between now and the election will change that.
Well, according to the latest polls, that budget hasn't led to a reverse in the government's fortunes as they hoped. YouGov have the Tories still stuck exactly where they were before the Chancellor's speech, on 20%. That's 27 points behind Labour, who are up 1 on last month, and the Conservatives only 7 ahead of Reform UK. So what can Rishi Sunak do to turn that around? Joining us now to discuss this and more is former Tory MP Neil Parish. Welcome to the show. Let me ask you, in the context of the budget, the Conservatives were, frankly, stealing two policies of the Labour Party. Doesn't that really show now what some people describe as the fag end of this Parliament, that the Conservatives are actually in opposition now and it's Labour who have seized the agenda? I mean, isn't it really time that we just called time and had a general election?
Well, I think, Nick, the problem is that we've borrowed so much money over this Parliament, and we're now at 101% of GDP, so our borrowings are higher than our whole gross domestic product of 1 year. And so we're sort of acting more like a Labour government than a Conservative one, and I think that is the problem, and people are very worried about it. Actually sort of stealing some of Labour's clothes is probably not the worst strategy of the Chancellor could have found, because of course it messes up their budget as they go forward into the general election. But I think...
Well, can I just stop you on that point? Because it's absolutely right. It has messed up Labour's calculations. But was this then really a budget for the Conservative Party than one that is much needed for the country?
I don't think so, because if it was if Jeremy Hunt was overall going to do something that was good for the Conservative Party, he would have slashed many more taxes, and he would have been imprudent. The only trouble is, of course, we had the Liz Truss fiasco, where it frightened the money markets. We had a run on the pound and a huge problem there. So he was not going to repeat that. But is he being overcautious? Yes, I think he has. I think Liz Truss decided to ignore the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibilities. I think, in a way, Jeremy Hunt has almost been taken captive by it. And I think, if you're going to govern, for God's sake, govern. And I'm not sure that we are, and that's much I agree with you in your opening remarks.
Well, there is certainly a case to say that government has, if you like, subcontracted decision-making, and we'll talk about that perhaps another time. But at the heart of this budget, what is not being talked about on the day, but much talked about now, is that Jeremy Hunt, as described by one commentator, has become the fiscal drag queen. He has imposed huge taxes on the British public, the voting British public, by freezing tax thresholds. So he gave $10 billion away in NIC cuts, but he's raising nearly 5 times that by freezing these tax thresholds. That's not what a Conservative government should be doing, is it?
I think that's probably what a lot of Conservative MPs are thinking about at the moment. I think the problem he's got is that even, day to day, we're still borrowing 10 billion a month, aren't we, to balance our books. So he's had to keep these taxes rolling in. And so what he's done is he's cut national insurance, hopefully to boost employment as well. Because the other issue we've got is we've got an economy that's shrinking. It's not growing like it should. We've got, nearly 7-8 million people who've not gone back to the workplace since COVID. And then we've got a huge problem on the other side with migration.
Well, this is where the OBR supported Jeremy Hunt, isn't it?
And that's where we've got to get more of our homegrown labour back into the workforce. Otherwise, we're never going to solve the other big thorny issue, which is not talked about in the budget, because there's 2 great issues for the Tory party and on the people on the right is about cutting taxes and also cutting migration. But at the moment, we're in the worst of all worlds as far as they are concerned, because we're actually taxing people more. And of course, more people are coming into the country because social care, farming, which I do a lot with and politics of, we need actually migrant labour to do the jobs that we can't get a local
but something has gone wrong if we have, of those 8 million economically inactive you talk about, I think it's slightly higher actually, 1.5 million don't want to work. I mean, simple as that. They're not ill, they're not sick, they don't want to work. They may be drawing support from the state. Did this budget really go anywhere to improving the incentives to work beyond just the fiscal incentive? Because it's not just fiscal incentive that's going to get these people back to work, is it?
No, I mean, you need a carrot and a stick, don't you? I mean, I quite often prefer a carrot to a stick. But
you're a farmer.
I'm a farmer, and my cattle don't like a stick. They prefer a carrot, seriously. But I think the problem is that there are some people in this country that are work shy. And there you do actually need to probably look very carefully at what benefits they're getting. It's quite a cruel situation, but you have got to bring it home to people that you can't expect to just get a living and somebody else pay for it. But I think there's more to do actually to get people's health better and get them in a mental frame to work. Because I think the other problem was that I think COVID, and perhaps we all did it. I mean, I'm 67 now. You all start to think about your mortality, don't you? And I think what's happened with quite a lot of people is they've moved themselves out of the workplace because they think, well, I may not have that much longer to live. I may as well enjoy it. And if they can just about get by, they do. But the problem is this really is dragging the country down. And we seem to be quite peculiar across the whole of Europe.
We are.
We seem to have fewer people coming back to work than the French and the Germans and the Spanish and the Italians and Eastern Europe. So why is it all of a sudden that the British have decided, perhaps we'll take an easier life?
Well, could it be, and the budget hasn't really undone this, could it be that it doesn't pay to work enough? So, for example, we're in a country where you can now earn £70,000, and yet we've just given the people who are married with 2 children, we're giving them over £1,000 extra through the tax system, which someone's got to pay for. Is it really right that someone on £70,000 should be getting another £1,000 a year from the state to help raise a family they chose to have, where those at the lower end of the scale, someone on £22,000 a year, they're barely getting more than £180 back on their national insurance savings? Haven't we just taken away the incentives to work?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you take the constituency I used to represent, Tiverton, Honiton, where you'd have, your average wage would be probably under 30,000, then it's crazy. But of course, we live in a sort of two-stage world in this country. You've got the southeast and London, where actually somebody earning 60 or 70,000 pounds between them is not actually that well off. Because of the cost of living in London. The cost of living outside of London, the cost of housing, the cost of everything, cost of rents is so much lower. And so this is the problem the government's got. And of course, half the time, because the decisions are made here in London, I sometimes think it becomes London-centric. Well, I think this is almost the problem that not only this Chancellor's got, I mean, the next government, the Labour Party can go on about how terrible the Tories are, but God help them if they do get back into government, because they have got all of this borrowed money has got to be paid for. And don't forget, they would have actually spent more had they been in power. So I don't know where this takes us.
Before we have a chance to even talk about Labour, let me bring you back to a core group of supporters that the Conservatives have consistently looked after, and that's pensioners, 12 million of them who predominantly vote Conservative. There were no specific measures in this budget for pensioners, particularly. They lose out because they're not earning, so they're not paying national insurance charges anyway. In fact, they don't have to at retirement age. But guess what? You're dragging millions of them back into tax because the thresholds have been frozen. I mean, some would say this was a political budget. If it was, you've just annoyed potentially millions of your voters by taxing them when they're on pensions. Is that right?
It's not. And the Tory party, must remember that rightly or wrongly, it gets a lot of its votes from the older population. And the triple lock has been a good thing, but you see now you're going to just bring a lot of people back into tax. You're just making everything so complicated, aren't you? We're living in such a complicated world. I mean, I run a business. Everything is complicated. And I just think Jeremy Hunt is complicating it more in order to get money back.
It did sound for a minute that he was going to move to simplify the tax system. But let me ask you one final question. You're a former Conservative MP of many, many years, and yet you have, and I'm grateful for this, been very candid about your opinion, some of the mistakes the party are making. We're going to have an election this year. I think that's fairly certain. Will you still vote Conservative?
I will vote Conservative because I've got a new local candidate that I rate. A guy called Ashley Fox. Had it been the previous MP that I had to vote for, I would not have done. I'm not going to mention his name, but it's got down to the stage now where you've got to have not just a reason to tick the Tory box. You've got to know the individual, and I think this is the trouble. And I think my own wife is not entirely sure whether she'll vote Conservative or not. Interesting when the general election comes, of course, because I think people then have to decide it's not a by-election. Are we going to change a government? What are the consequences? Because I actually like Rishi Sunak, and I think he's had a terrible hand of cards dealt to him.
Well, Neil Parish, thank you very much indeed for your candour and for joining me here on Westminster Watch. One of the key battlegrounds in the next election will be the economy. And while the public appears to back many of the measures in the budget, it hasn't been the popularity boost the government needed. While the headline 2% cut in national insurance was deemed a good idea by more than half the country, almost 1 in 3 thought it was the wrong priority for the present time. Overall, there appears to be a sense of apathy, with 52% of those polled saying the budget as a whole won't make much of a difference to the country. Just 9% say it will make the UK better off, and while 14% think it will be worse off. According to the Resolution Foundation, after accounting for inflation, household disposable incomes have fallen by almost 1% over the course of the whole Parliament. That's the first time in modern history. Pensioners will be the age group hit hardest by this budget, with $10 billion being redistributed elsewhere, an average of $981 each, while those between 18 and 45 will be better off by $752 per year. The think tank also criticised both parties for misleading the public over the state of the nation's finances, calling the proposed cuts to public services fiscal fiction. The budget also plans for tax rises after the next election, something the report calls a troubling inheritance for whichever party wins the next election. I'm pleased to say joining me now to discuss this are Holly Mead, Deputy Money Editor at The Times, and economist Vicky Pryce, who was previously the joint head of the UK's Government Economic Service. Welcome to you both. Vicky, if I may, let me start with you. In respect to the budget, was this the right budget at the right time for the UK?
If we think of whether the UK needed a bit of a push in terms of growth, given that we hardly grew in 2023, we had just 0.1% growth and recession in the second half, giving something back, given that taxes had increased so significantly for the average worker, made sense if you wanted to push that economy along. And that comes, of course, on top of, with a bit of luck, getting interest rates down, which should happen given that inflation forecast that we heard again in the budget, are now quite optimistic, or in some ways sort of quite benign. We're talking about reaching, once again, a target of 2%, even below that. So interest rates should come down as well. And with the cost of living crisis, therefore, easing, you may wonder why you needed additionally to have a cut in national insurance contributions, but it will propel, I think, consumer spending up to a point. But also, I think it is very much a political budget, because if you manage to get the well-being factor to improve a little bit, then...
The feel-good factor, as we're constantly told
the feel-good
politicians
factor.
are searching
Yes, the feel-good factor. You can get perhaps a boost in people's perhaps thinking they might want to vote Conservatives again. So it's a long shot.
I mean,
there
it
we
is.
are.
I mean, the Conservative strategy, Holly, is simply, if you like, let people fear of the unknown with Labour, but actually things are getting better with us. Now, interestingly, a Snap poll after the budget said that whilst people were relatively indifferent to the measures, none of them, 76%, felt that it was going to make any impact on the cost of living pressures. In this budget, did you see it as a budget that was designed to help cost of living pressures on families, or was it, as Vicky's suggesting, more of a political budget?
It was just a bit of a damp squib of a budget, wasn't it? And I think the idea is they want people to feel immediately like there's a bit more cash in their back pocket. We'll see 500,000 families are going to benefit from the reforms to child benefit. The average worker, £450 in their pocket from national insurance. And hey, beer's not going up in price anymore, but I don't know about you, but it's about £7 a pint in my local. But it doesn't work when people are already in a sort of deficit because of those frozen tax thresholds. So anything that was given yesterday has already been taken before.
I don't want to sound like a patronising, out-of-touch 65-year-old, but the reason I'm presuming the government talk about tax thresholds being frozen is the public aren't really aware of it. Is that true, do you think?
I mean, I don't think we should underestimate the electorate and the public. And I think also the national insurance chipping and chopping and changing around all the time is a really good example of that. It's only 2 years ago that the national insurance was being put up 1.25 percentage points because we have to all club together for the social levy, which made a lot of sense. And now the exact same government is cutting it and saying, hey, we might get rid of it altogether. We don't need national insurance. What message does that send?
Certainly, it's a bit of a roller coaster in terms of measures that we've seen over the last few years, but not dwell on the Conservative pain of those last 2 or 3 years. Let me ask you, one thing that struck me in the budget was that there was an attempt to address the productivity issue in the public sector. Jeremy Hunt looked at the health service and said, you know, we can actually look after 200,000 patients more a year if we get our IT systems better and so forth. Are these measures you think were sensible and good for the country, Vicky?
Investing something in the National Health Service makes a huge amount of sense anyway. So if you are able to digitalise a little bit more, to have the scanners that are necessary, and to be able to do more procedures with whatever you've got already in terms of manpower, that with that help, then I think that's all to the good. And a considerable amount is being put aside for that, 3.8 billion. from next year onwards. Well, that, of course, may not be enough to really change the way in which the National Health Service works, because we're talking about 1 billion each year. But I think it's very, very hard generally to measure productivity in the public sector. Do you do it in terms of how many patients you've got who go through, or do you do it in terms of the outcomes, such as cancer diagnosis and prevention of deaths?
But on all measures, they're not doing very well at the moment.
Not at all, not at all. Yeah. So something extra is needed. But the worry about the budget is that it assumes that that extra money, there is also an extra 800 million, which is meant to be going for other services to improve productivity there as well, focusing a lot on the digitalization more generally. But you can't, apart from not being able to measure it, the expectation that there would be savings just in the National Health Service of something like 35 billion over this period, which can then be used to cut taxes in the future.
That's a huge prize.
It's a huge prize. I mean, as Holly was saying, if you take away the national insurance contributions, the employees one, there is still the employers one, of course. The employees, you have to find some 45 billion from somewhere. So the hope that this will all come from improvements in productivity in the public sector, and then you can use it to cut taxes, I think is for the birds, frankly.
The IFS have been very condemning about the budget. They actually say there is a conspiracy of silence, Holly, between the Conservatives and Labour, in that none of them are talking about the big price tag to come. Cuts in public sector, public services,